In this video, I talk about a new set of wargame rules that I have written, covering the period up to 1200 AD or so. These can also be used for fantasy and ancient wargames. Indeed, I have been using them for some of the more recent Halfland battles. Now, you may point out that I have already written rules covering this period and set them all out in great detail, possibly too much detail, in a previous video. So, why am I reinventing the wheel? Were my previous rules no good? Well, I was, and still am, pretty happy with my previous rules. But I must now have fought 100 tabletop battles with them, and so I feel like a change. And the mechanics of any rule set will restrict what it can do and how play is structured, and it is interesting to explore rules that are structured differently and focus on different areas. I also found that some aspects of my old rules were unnecessarily detailed, such as the way that different figures' movement distances were calculated, or the different armour types. In some ways, it is nice to be able to make these subtle distinctions between troop types, and it has its place, but I found that in most games they were not adding much value. Having less granularity also meant that I could measure distance in inches rather than centimetres. I have nothing against centimetres. In their place they are completely valid, and I would not dispute their right to exist and do their own particular thing. But they are just a bit small to use when measuring distances on a wargaming table, making everything rather fiddly and fussy. I find inches a much more convenient unit to use. And one of the things I've always disliked about my previous rules is that they use 20-sided dice. I have always felt that non-cubic dice are all very well for role-playing, but for wargaming I like my dice to be 6-sided. I just do. So these new rules only use 6-sided dice. But the main reason for producing these new rules is simply that I love writing wargame rules, trying them out and tinkering with them. I just can't help myself. Now, my previous set of rules has a couple of features that I am very attached to. The first is the ability to fight both skirmish games, where one figure represents one person, and battle games, where one figure represents, say, 20 to 30 people. The second is that there is flexibility as to how figures are formed and reform into groups in the course of a game. There are no fixed units consisting of identically equipped figures, although you can of course structure your army like that if you want, and in some scenarios it may be appropriate. But the rules allow you to form ad hoc groups of figures during a battle and use them as a unit. The mechanism my previous rules used to achieve this is an activation system which allows any group of figures in contact to be activated together. However, for gameplay to give sensible outcomes, that particular mechanic as I implemented it requires each player's turn to be split into movement, range combat and melee combat segments. There is nothing wrong with that. It is pretty common in wargames rules. But it does mean, firstly, that if I charge my cavalry into your infantry, I have to wait until the end of the turn to see how my boys do in the fight, which can distract from the immersive experience. And secondly, because all combat in a turn is simultaneous, with every figure on the table potentially participating in it, when going through the combat phases, it can be tricky to keep track of which attacks have already been resolved, who has been shot, which figures have been pushed back in melee, and so on. Again, many rules do take this approach, but I am getting older and becoming increasingly absent-minded. Anyway, I decided to write an alternative set of rules, which keep the things I really liked about the old rules, but changed some of the things that were starting to get a bit stale. In this video, I am going to describe these new rules. If you want a copy of them, then drop an email to the channel's email address and I will send you a copy. just remember that these are my rules, written for my use, using language that I understand, and manage your expectations accordingly. One thing that the new rules do have going for them is that they are only 6 pages long. 3 pages of core rules, 2 pages of optional rules, and 1 page of tables, etc. They are also flexible as regards figures and basing. I have fought battles using 1/72 scale figures on 20mm square bases, and also using 10mm figures on 15mm round bases. Let's begin. As in many wargame rules, the core mechanic is activation. In the new rules, this is built around the idea that on a battlefield there will be leaders, and they are the ones who will make things happen. So each figure on the table will be designated either as a standard figure or as a leader. Each leader has a command number. This is the maximum number of standard figures that leader can issue orders to each time it is activated. The command numbers should be set so that if you add up all the command numbers of all the leaders in a force, it equals the number of standard figures in that force. In practical terms, take all your standard figures, divide them into groups, and add a leader to each group, that leader having a command number equal to the number of standard figures in the group. In theory, there is no limit to a leader's command number. As leaders with high command numbers are more powerful, you might think that having a few leaders with high command numbers would be the way to go. However, leaders are important. A force that loses most of its leaders is a force that is in serious difficulties. This is an argument for keeping command numbers low, so you can have more leaders in your force. On balance, I suggest that command numbers no lower than 3 and no higher than 6 work best, and that you probably don't want more than 5 or 6 leaders in a force, not least to reduce the risk that you lose track of which of your leaders have already been activated in a turn. Maxing out force size under these guidelines would mean an army of 6 leaders, each with a command value of 6, and so in total leading 36 standard figures. That is 42 figures in total, which is a big army under these rules, where you would be typically using 20 to 30 figures per side for a 2 to 3 hour game. So, how do you actually play? Well, the game is divided into turns. At the start of each turn, the players dice for the initiative. The player who wins the initiative can then activate a leader. Then the other player gets to activate a leader, and so on, until all leaders have been activated. A player who does not wish to activate a leader when given the opportunity to do so can instead pass play back to the other player. A player who has run out of leaders to activate must pass play back to the other player. If both players pass consecutively, or if there are no leaders left to activate, that ends this section of the turn. I am currently on version 12 of these rules, and it is fair to say that it is the activation system that has changed most as the rules have evolved. One of the other mechanisms I tried was a completely random system, where every leader on the table has a number, you roll a die, activate the corresponding leader, and just repeat until the game is over. This is extremely entertaining, particularly when the same leader is activated 4 times in a row, but ultimately it is just too random. I also tried a card-based activation system. The card-based system works well for skirmish games and adds some friction and uncertainty, which is good for solo play. However, I chose instead to incorporate friction into the system for giving orders and use the alternating activation system I have described, as it allows for some strategic thought in deciding which leader to activate and when. It also allows a player to immediately react to a move by their opponent without requiring Overwatch or reaction rules. When a leader is activated, it can give orders to any standard figures on its side that are within 3 inches of it. it can only issue one order to each such figure, and it can issue a maximum number of orders equal to its command number. Note, however, that a leader can give an order to a figure that has already been given an order by another leader activated earlier in the turn. This means that the positioning of your leaders is important. If a group of figures has several leaders in it, the standard figures in that group might each be able to take several actions each turn. However, this probably means that troops in other areas of the table will not be within 3 inches of a leader and therefore may not be able to take any meaningful actions at all. Once it has issued its orders to standard figures, a leader can itself take a single action. Note that leaders cannot issue orders to other leaders. There are only 4 orders that can be given: move, range attack, melee attack, or withdraw. Usually a figure can only be ordered to undertake one of these actions. There are 2 exceptions to this. A figure armed with javelins can make a single range attack and then move, melee attack, or withdraw. And a horse archer can make a range attack, which can be a multiple range attack, and then move or withdraw. In both cases, the combined order given to the figure only counts as a single order. I mentioned that I used the order system to introduce friction into the game. This is done by randomly introducing restrictions on the orders that can be given in each activation. This can be justified by observing that it is harder to get men to attack the enemy than it is to get them to run away, for example. So when a leader is activated, a command die is rolled. On a roll of 1, the leader can only order figures to withdraw or range attack. On a roll of 2, it can in addition order figures to move. On a roll of 3 or more, the full range of orders is available. This command roll does not limit the actions that the leader itself can take, only the orders it can issue to standard figures. A leader can always give itself any order it likes. A leader does not have to decide which orders to issue until after the command roll is made, and can give different orders to different figures as long as they are orders permitted by that initial command roll. Orders are issued to one figure at a time, with the ordered figure completing its action before an order is issued to the next figure, with the leader itself taking the last action. Once all leader activations have been completed, each player has an opportunity to activate standard figures that are more than 3 inches distant from any leader who could give them an order if that leader was activated. The player who lost the initiative roll has the first chance to do this. That player nominates an eligible figure, makes a special command roll, issues an allowable order, and actions it. The same player can then repeat this process for any other such figures until orders have been issued to all that player's figures which are more than 3 inches from a leader, or until the player does not wish to issue any more such orders. No more than one order can be given to any one figure during this whole process. Note that a separate command roll is made for each figure, unlike the leader activation process where a single command roll applies to all the figures given orders by that leader during that activation. The player who won the initiative then goes through the same process with any of their standard figures that are more than 3 inches from one of their leaders. The turn then ends. Now, when giving orders to standard figures more than 3 inches from a leader, the command roll restricts available orders as follows. A withdrawal order can always be given. An order to range attack can only be given on a roll of 4 or more. An order to move can only be given on a roll of 5 or more. And an order to melee attack can only be given on a roll of 6. So, getting figures that are more than 3 inches from a leader to do anything other than fall back is somewhat challenging. Okay, so we've been through the basic mechanics of activating leaders and giving orders to figures. The only other core rules relate to the details of each of the 4 possible orders. Let's start with movement. This is simple. Each type of figure has a different movement distance. 6 inches for unarmoured infantry, 5 inches for armoured infantry, 12 inches for unarmoured cavalry, and 9 inches for armoured cavalry. Figures can move up to this distance in any direction, change direction as often as they like during a move, and the facing of figures doesn't matter. Figures can move freely through friendly figures, but not unfriendly ones. Indeed, a figure must not contact an enemy figure at any point in its move, unless it starts its move in contact with an enemy figure, in which case it can move away from that figure. If so, it must open up a gap of 1 inch between it and the figure it is moving away from as quickly as possible, and cannot move within 1 inch of another enemy figure during its move. And that's it for movement. The only other factor to consider is terrain. This works in a similar way to my previous rules. If a figure moves into or over or through terrain that is considered to impede movement, it suffers a reduction of 2 inches in its maximum movement distance. These penalties do not stack. Movement distance is only reduced by 2 inches, no matter how many different pieces of terrain a figure encounters in its move. Withdrawal is subject to the same rules as movement, with the additional requirement that at no point during its move can a withdrawing figure reduce the distance between it and the enemy figure that is then nearest to it. That leaves range and melee attacks. Let's start with range attacks. Range attacks are always directed at a single nominated target enemy figure. To make a range attack, a figure must meet the following requirements, which are all pretty standard. So a figure can't make a range attack if it is in contact with an enemy figure. A figure cannot range attack a target figure that is in contact with a figure friendly to the range attacking figure. The target must be within range of the range attacking figure, and there must be a clear line of sight between the range attacking figure and the target figure. Line of sight runs from centre base to centre base. It's blocked by the bases of other figures and blocked by terrain in the way you would expect. Some weapons can make multiple range attacks. This multiple range attack is still directed at a single target figure. A figure cannot range attack multiple target figures in the same activation. Having nominated the target figure and whether or not you're making a multiple attack, calculate the to hit number. This is 4 plus 1 if the target is in cover and minus 1 if a multiple range attack is being made on the target. Then roll 2 dice. If they both come up equal to or greater than the to hit number, then you've hit the target. If you've hit the target, roll a single die. If this equals or exceeds the target figure's armour value, the target is removed from play. Otherwise, the armour does its job and there is no effect. Longbows and crossbows add 1 to this die roll, because they're powerful. Before I move on to melee attacks, if you have been paying attention to the pictures on screen, you will have noticed that, unlike my previous rules, the same ranges are used for weapons in both skirmish and battle games. My justification for this is that the effective range of medieval weapons would be significantly longer in situations where large groups of people are shooting arrows at other large groups of people, rather than when individuals are shooting at individuals. An individual is not only a smaller target, but might even be able to observe the flight of a projectile coming from a distance away and step aside. After all, arrows and javelins are not rifle bullets, although seeing a slingshot coming in your direction and dodging it might admittedly be more challenging. Anyway, the rules assume that the differences in effective range cancel out the change in implied ground scale between skirmish and battle games, which at least has the advantage of simplicity. That leaves melee attacks. The first thing to note is that in this game, a figure will only strike at another figure if it is ordered to do so. If it is in contact with an enemy figure but is not ordered to attack, it will just stand there, unless it is ordered to move away or withdraw. This means that a melee attack is that and only that. The attacking figure tries to hit the target figure. The target figure does not get to hit back. Its chance will come if it, in due turn, is given an order to melee attack. If a figure that is not in contact with an enemy figure is given a melee attack order, it must move in a single straight line directly into contact with an enemy figure. Normal movement rules apply, except that the melee attacking figure cannot change direction while moving, and it must stop moving as soon as it comes into contact with an enemy figure. A figure that is already in contact with an enemy figure when it is ordered to melee attack cannot move. After making any move in this way, the melee attacking figure nominates a target, which can be any enemy figure it is in base-to-base contact with. It then rolls a die to hit. The basic roll required to hit in melee is 4+. However, if the striking figure's weapon has a longer reach than the figure it is striking at, then 1 is added to the roll, so a hit will be scored on a roll of 3+. Conversely, if the figure being struck has the longer reach, then 1 is subtracted from the roll, so a hit will only be scored on a roll of 5+. If a hit is scored, then a roll is made against the target's armour value, in the same way as for a hit from a range attack. Polearms, Daneaxes and two-handed swords add 1 to this roll, as do cavalry armed with lances and on the charge. That is, if the mounted figure has moved into contact with their foe as part of this melee attack, rather than being in contact initially. Okay, those are the core rules, which are all you need to play a game. So, if desired, you can stop here. However, there are some optional rules, and to finish I will briefly describe them. You can use all, any or none of these optional rules as you prefer, although I do recommend using the ammunition and bravery rules. So the first of these optional rules are in fact the ammunition rules. These work in the same way as in my previous rules, so I refer you to that video for more details. The next optional rule is that figures armed with two-handed spears, who are not themselves in contact with an enemy figure, may strike at an enemy figure that is in contact with a figure friendly to the figure with the two-handed spear that the figure with the two-handed spear is in contact with. That sounds a bit complicated, but all it really means is that figures with two-handed spears can strike from the second rank, or, if you prefer to describe it thus, over the shoulder of a friendly figure. The next optional rule relates to bravery tests. I like this rule, as it introduces a bit of confusion and disorder into melee, rather than having two lines of figures bashing at each other until all the members of one group or the other are killed. It performs much the same function as the pushback rules in my previous rule set. The bravery test is pretty simple. If a natural 6 comes up when rolling against a figure's armour following a hit, whether this be a result of range or melee combat, then not only is the struck figure killed, but all figures within 3 inches of the struck figure and with a clear line of sight to it have to take an immediate bravery test. If this test is failed, then the testing figure must immediately act as if it had been ordered to withdraw, moving so as to maximise the distance between it and the figure that delivered the killing hit. To take a bravery test, roll a die and apply modifiers as follows. Subtract 1 from the roll if the testing figure has a higher armour value than the killed figure. Add 1 to the roll if the testing figure has a lower armour value than the killed figure. Subtract 1 from the roll if the testing figure is a leader. Add 1 to the roll if the killed figure was a leader. And if the adjusted die roll is 4 or more, the test is failed. Okay, next are a couple of optional rules about leaders. The first is the command snobbery rule. This says that figures who are not wearing armour cannot give orders to figures who are wearing armour. This is intended to reflect the hierarchical social structure of the early Middle Ages. The next rule is the force commander rule. One leader in each force is nominated at the start of the game as the force commander. The force commander gets a +1 adjustment to its command roll and can give orders to any other figure, including leaders, that are within 3 inches of it. Another optional rule allows for an army to include one or more characters. A character is a leader with a command number of 0. As such, it has no ability to give orders to other figures, but when activated can itself take any action desired, without having to make a command roll. In small skirmish games, you may wish to make every figure on the table a character, and maybe think about using card-based activation rather than letting the players choose who gets activated when. The next rule increases the terrain movement penalty from 2 inches to 3 inches for figures on foot armed with spears, polearms or warbows. If you have ever tried to carry an 8-foot spear through a dense forest, you will understand the justification for this rule. There are some more detailed terrain rules, which more or less duplicate those in my previous rules, and which I will not cover again here. The core rules assume that javelins are relatively light weapons, rather than heavy javelins, such as the Roman pilum. The optional rules allow for these heavier, very short-range javelins by requiring that they are used as part of melee combat rather than range combat. This is done by allowing troops armed with such weapons to make a single range attack against a figure they are in contact with immediately prior to striking at an opponent in melee. For ammunition purposes, each figure armed with a pilum is assumed to carry one of these weapons. The final optional rule suggests that, for plot purposes, some characters or leaders might be given special abilities, for example, +1 when rolling to hit with their favourite weapon, or an increased armour value reflecting their agility, high quality armour, or luck. But, just be careful not to make your characters too overpowered. And that brings us to the last page of the rules, which is a page of tables for reference during the game, and which includes some special rules for fantasy games, designed to make dwarves slow, wolf riders scary, and halflings useless. Although it must be said that so far, the halflings of Halfland have punched above their weight. So what do I know? Maybe I just underestimated the weight of halflings. After all, they are chubby little fellas. As I said earlier, if you want a copy of these rules, then do drop me an email. I am more than happy to share them. If you have any questions or observations about the rules, then please do leave a comment below. I am currently working on some rules for Age of Sail and also for World War II, so if you would like to see videos on those rules in due course, then do let me know in the comments. And above all, have fun and carry on wargaming.